Okay, good morning, Mayor and Council. I'm Edna Cho, Senior Planner in Housing Policy in the Planning Department. So today's update to Council will cover 4 topics. First, we'll go over the background, then share with you the results of the last 10 years of rental incentive programs. Next, we'll look at issues facing renters today, so what's changed in the last 10 years, and conclude with next steps for program improvements. We've received significant direction from Council to review the city's rental incentive programs, beginning with the adoption of the Housing Vancouver 3-year action plan in 2017 to increase supply to meet targets, to a series of motions passed this year to explore increased affordability and ways to improve the DCL waiver. We're doing this review in 2 phases. Phase 1 is backwards looking. We've documented the results over the last 10 years and assessed whether the program is meeting city objectives. And that's what we are reporting out to you on today. Phase 2, beginning in August, is policy development. We'll be exploring improvements to our current policies and bylaws, as well as looking at ways to introduce the use of the new rental zoning tool recently enabled by the province. Here's our work plan. We're now finished phase 1. We are targeting a report to Council in late fall with an amended rental incentives policy and amendments to the DCL and utilities bylaws. Implementation will be in Q1 2020, where we'll be bringing back specific changes to relevant district schedules at a public hearing. So that's a bit about the work plan. Let's go into the results of phase 1. So to help complete this work, we hired 2 consultants. First, we have City Spaces Consulting, which provides community planning, development consulting, and consultation services, including developing affordable housing strategies for communities throughout Western Canada. City Spaces helped us document and analyze the results of our incentive programs, including a review of all the rental applications that were approved under these programs and a summary of the consultation process. We have Noha Sedki from City Spaces here with us today, and she'll be available to answer any questions from Council. Our second consultant is Coriolis Consulting, experts on urban land economics and development. In phase 1, they looked at the viability of rental projects and tested whether our current incentives are working, as well as a number of other ideas that came up during the review. Moving forward in phase 2, they will be testing our policy options to ensure they're economically viable. Okay, so let's start with the results from the City Spaces report. We know that the majority of Vancouver households are renters. Market rental housing is just one element of the housing continuum, as shown in their graphic here. Each type of housing responds to different needs, and all parts are important in order to ensure a healthy system. Stepping back, it's important to acknowledge that there were a number of federal programs put in place during the 1950s to the 1980s that encouraged the private sector to build market rental, and which has created the vast majority of Vancouver's rental stock. You can see the sharp decline of rental supply after 1980 when the federal government withdrew these programs, along with the introduction of the Strata Titles Act in 1966. It's these 2 things together that have significantly impacted the production of new market rental, resulting in very little new supply constructed over the last 40 years. And this has led to persistently low vacancy rate. So it's within this context that the city's rental incentives were introduced. Over the last 10 years, the city introduced a number of policies and programs to fill the rental supply void. Beginning in 2009, the city launched the Short-Term Incentives for Rental program, STIR for short. It was a 2.5-year pilot that was introduced right after the financial crash of 2008. The program was designed to stimulate the local economy, as well as to test interest in rental development. Back then, we honestly didn't know if the industry was interested in developing rental, since there had been so little built in the previous decades. The incentives offered were increased height and density, parking relaxations, the DCL waiver, unit size relaxations, and expedited processing. Projects could also be mixed strata or 100% rental buildings under this program. So STIR was replaced with Rental 100 in 2012, which narrowed the program parameters to provide more clarity around densities and heights and to allow only 100% rental buildings. Next, the Affordable Housing Choices Interim Rezoning Policy was put in place in late 2012 out of the Mayor's Task Force on Housing Affordability. The goal was to demonstrate the transition zone concept, where ground-oriented housing types provide a transition between higher density arterial streets and single-family areas. Finally, recently completed community plans have put in place policies to achieve a wide variety of housing, including new market rental. So City Spaces reviewed and documented the results from these 4 streams. In terms of the results for STIR, the program resulted in 1,300 rental units, with the vast majority of them, 82%, being studio and 1-beds. For form of development, there was a mix, but mostly apartment forms with an average of 14 stories. STIR allowed mixed rental strata projects, but we found that significantly more rental units were created in the 100% rental buildings compared to the mixed strata rental buildings. And so that's why Rental 100 was narrowed, the program parameters, to allow for only 100% rental projects. The program also provided more clarity around supportable locations, form of development, heights, and introduced family housing requirements. Under this program, 40 projects with over 3,200 units were approved. And out of the 4 program streams, this is the one that has produced the most rental. It also produced buildings with lower heights and densities compared to STIR, and more family housing units were approved, with over 37% compared to 18% under STIR. Next is the Affordable Housing Choices Interim Rezoning Policy. So the intent of the program was broader than just delivering rental. It was to test affordability through innovation in housing tenures, such as co-housing, life leases, etc. So as a result, we didn't get the same take-up for rental in this policy compared to the others. 8 projects with approximately 420 units of rental, with 33% of those units suitable for families. In general, applicants found this program confusing. How is it different than Rental 100? What constitutes an innovative housing form? And we also heard it was difficult to deliver the projects due to the spacing requirements of no more than 2 projects on a 10-block radius. The community plans have produced a significant proportion of the overall new rental in the city, with 2,000 units, the majority of which have been approved under the West End plan. Looking at the DCL waiver, we found that it has enabled over 2,700 units of rental. In context, the city collected $600 million in DCL since 2010, and $25 million have been waived for market rental, accounting for 4% of the overall DCL revenue. This represents a city investment of approximately $8,800 per rental unit. In terms of take-up, over half of the rental projects took the waiver, primarily those in the Eastside, and the report cited the most common reasons why projects didn't take the waiver are that market rents are higher on the West Side and developers prefer not to have restricted rents, and that some of the requirements for the DCL waiver are complicated and challenging to meet. So this concludes the high-level summary of the projects enabled through the different program streams. And here's what they look like on a map. Let's now turn our attention to the renters living in these buildings. As part of the review, we conducted a post-occupancy survey of buildings open under the rental incentive programs. So surveys were sent to all 30 completed buildings. We received 460 responses, which is an 18% response rate. An overwhelming number of respondents were under the age of 44 at 70%, and households were evenly divided between single and couple households. Okay, so what did they tell us? We heard that renters are having a very hard time finding housing and that new rental is starting to fill the gap. There's lots of competition, limited options, and high rents, leading to stress, frustration, and panic. Those that are able to find something feel fortunate. One renter described securing a lease in a new rental building like winning the lottery. The survey identified the top reasons why respondents chose to live in new market rental. The number one reason being it was the best option for their budget, followed by it was in a neighborhood they like, close to transit or work, pet-friendly, and more affordable than other options out there. So here's a quote: "We like the neighborhood, we like the building, we like the suite, and the price is great compared to what else is out there." In terms of incomes, we found that more than half of the respondents in these buildings were earning less than $80,000 per year. but that many are making trade-offs to meet their needs. 60% reported paying more than 30% of their gross income on rent, and many are paying higher rents and living in smaller units, but are doing so for a variety of reasons. They want to live in a new building that's pet-friendly, in a desirable location, close to amenities. Here's a quote. I decided owning anything was always going to be out of reach, so I decided to rent a nice new place. I wanted a top floor for noise reduction and a patio space. The only trade-off is the price. In terms of who is moving into new rental, we found that the majority of respondents, 57%, were from Vancouver. Of those, the vast majority, over 75%, were renters. So they could be moving from another form of rental, likely the existing older stock or the secondary stock. We also found that approximately 30% were from other parts of Canada outside Vancouver, so perhaps coming in for jobs. Finally, we found that the vast majority, almost 80%, agreed that incentives should be provided to encourage the building of new market rental. Here's a quote. It is a practical solution to the housing crisis. It serves the middle of the market that does not qualify for social housing and cannot or does not desire to be a homeowner. So that's the summary of the post-occupancy survey. In the next section, I'm going to run through some of the key issues identified by City Spaces around the rental programs. First, there was evidence of parking oversupply in new market rental. So through the post-occupancy survey, 57% of respondents indicated that they don't use parking available in their building and that over 50% don't own a car. Through a survey with the development industry that have experience with our rental programs, almost 50% of respondents indicated that less than half of the parking spaces they built are being utilized. Next, City Spaces analyzed the processing times for rezoning projects over the last 10 years. Overall, approval times are lengthy. City Spaces cited that longer approval times create risk and uncertainty for developers. What we found is that the programs that are vague, complex, and that have a lot of flexibility take longer to process than those that have a lot more specificity take less time. And you can see this reflected in the results between STIR and Rental 100. STIR was a pilot that didn't have all the details sorted out when introduced. STIR also had mixed tenure projects, which are more complex in terms of the requirements and the CAC process. Compare that to Rental 100, the processing times were significantly shorter because the program introduced a lot more clarity around location, form of development, and other city requirements. City Spaces also looked at the combined processing time for rezoning and development permit approvals. Again, the programs with the most clarity around form, development, location have the fastest approval times, and that's Rental 100. They also noted that the community plan areas that had the best processing times were the ones that required a development permit only, like in the West End, and did not need to go through the added time or cost of a rezoning. The consultant cited that fulfilling multiple city objectives under current policies add confusion, time, and can impact rental project viability. Some of the various requirements they identified include green building measures, family housing requirements, and tenant relocation plan requirements when there are existing renters on site. Next, through an analysis of public hearing reports, the review found competing concerns around neighborhood integration on some of these projects, so issues around height, density, and fit with the surrounding area on the one hand, versus a lack of choice and availability of rental housing in all neighborhoods on the other hand. City Spaces noted that the rental housing produced through our incentive programs tended to be concentrated on arterials and that they tended to be larger projects in apartment forms. The report noted that this has created an inequitable environment where renters have limited choice in form and location as it relates to the city as a whole. So to understand perception of buildings after they were open, we conducted an intercept survey with the public around 3 buildings which received typical comments during the rezoning process across different neighborhoods. We received 41 responses in total during 8 survey periods, and 90% of the respondents lived or worked in the neighborhood. And overall, there was limited negative feedback regarding the building design. The vast majority of respondents indicated that they felt the building design was good, like the height of the building and the shops associated with the businesses in the new retail component. So that concludes the main highlights of the City Spaces report. Let's move on to our second consultancy with Coriolis on the economic viability of rental projects. We wanted to understand the effectiveness of our current rental incentives. So some of the main questions we asked Coriolis to answer are the current incentives working? And what is the role of the DCL waiver? What is the impact of rental tenure zoning? There's been a lot of interest to understand if rental tenure zoning could be used in this context. And finally, we know Council has also expressed interest in applying vacancy control to new market rental, so we tested that as well. Before we look at the results, Coriolis laid out some parameters that are necessary if the city wants the private industry to create new rental housing. So first, development needs to be financially attractive. In order to do that, sufficient profit is required in order to obtain project financing and address the costs and risks associated with new development. Typically, a minimum profit margin of about 15% is required for multifamily projects to obtain construction financing. There are some specific circumstances where some developers may choose to proceed at a lower profit margin. So for example, developers interested in creating a portfolio of rental projects may accept a lower margin if they can't find existing rental properties to buy. Or developers may proceed with a rental project versus strata if they're concerned about short-term market risks. Coriolis tested a range of scenarios. How would rental projects work? First, under existing zoning without incentives. Second, how would they work with partial incentives? And finally, the last scenario, which is number 6 on the right, how would projects perform with the full incentives currently offered under our rental programs? For illustrative purposes, I'm going to walk you through one example to highlight the findings. We'll go through a typical Eastside C2 site, as this is where most of our new rental development has occurred. Under the existing zoning, there's a choice to develop rental or strata. And as you can see, strata development is much more attractive. A large financial gap exists between strata and rental, and without providing incentives, rental is not viable under existing zoning. So that's the purpose of the incentives offered under our current rental programs. They are meant to close the financial gap between strata and rental development. And as you can see, with the very last bar on your right, even with the full incentives under our current rental programs, strata development is still more attractive. Rental is just marginally viable in commercial areas. Market rental developments generates an estimated profit margin ranging from 7 to 11% under this testing. This is significantly lower than the typical profit margin required by most multifamily developers to obtain construction financing and proceed with a new project. It's also lower than the profit margin that can likely be achieved through strata development under existing zoning. As mentioned earlier, the consultant has provided specific circumstances in which a developer may proceed at a lower profit margin. And in his opinion, some owner-developers may consider rental projects that generate around 10% return on cost, represented by the dotted line. Anything lower would generally be getting too risky. So strata continues to be the most profitable option, and you can see this played out in this chart. Over the last 10 years, the vast majority, 67% of development in C2 zones have been strata condominiums. Coriolis also tested a variety of sites in apartment areas and other commercial zones and found similar results. Even with the current level of rental incentives, rental is marginally viable in these areas. Where this is different is in lower density areas, such as RS, single family, and RT duplex zones. We tested a range of densities and heights for apartments in line with what came in under the Affordable Housing Choices policy, so generally 4 to 6 story apartment forms. And we found that rental development is more financially viable in these areas, particularly in the west side. And this is in part because rental is not competing with stratas, as strata apartments are not allowed in single family areas. So just a note then, the opportunity to create more affordability or restructure incentives for rental may be possible in RS and RT areas, and where you see the projects getting closer or over the 15% return on cost is where there's room to adjust the policy objectives. For example, council can decide to provide less incentives or deepen affordability in these cases. To summarize the key findings on our current incentives, first, creating new market rental in commercial and apartment areas is financially challenging because it's not as profitable as the other uses that are allowed in those areas. Second, the current incentives are necessary to fill the financial gap to put rental on a more equal footing with those other uses. The most important of those incentives are additional density and the citywide DCL waivers. And without those incentives, many projects won't proceed. And finally, there may be a greater opportunity to enable rental in lower density areas, such as RS and RT zones, because stratas are not allowed, and the testing showed that rental in these areas could be more financially attractive. Next, we asked Coriolis to test the use of rental zoning in commercial areas. As you know, the province recently gave us the authority to zone for rental tenure. So let's walk through an example of how this could work under the existing zoning in C2. The current options are to retain the existing use. So, for example, this could be the full restaurant. The second option, you can redevelop as a 4-story strata under the existing zoning. And the third option is to go through a rezoning and develop as a 6-story rental. In order for rental to work, rental housing should have the highest value compared to strata and the existing use. So there are many approaches to rental zoning. Other municipalities have explored this tool as a way to protect the existing rental as a down zone or as well as a density bonus. We've had some questions from council around this. If strata outcompetes everything, what happens if we take that away? So we tested the down zone scenario here. And the way it could work would be to eliminate strata as a development option. And so here are the results. In the Eastside, the value of the site as an income-producing commercial property is worth more than redeveloping to either rental or strata. So a downzone approach will not work here in most cases. In the west side, the strata redevelopment option has the highest value, so eliminating strata as an option can make rental more viable, but will result in a significant reduction in land value for the property owner. In the case that was tested, it would be a reduction of $1.7 million. So what this tells us is that downzoning can work in areas where either strata or rental redevelopment is of a higher value than the existing use. The testing showed that downzoning strata does not improve rental viability on the east side because the existing use is higher than rental. It may work on the west side, however, it will negatively impact existing property owners by taking development rights away and reducing the value of their property. This is especially true for those who just bought their properties. So given the challenges described with downzoning, Coriolis provided an alternative approach to rental zoning for consideration to improve rental viability by providing incentives rather than taking property rights and values away from existing owners. This could be done by providing higher density for rental-only projects. The rental zoning tool could also be implemented through a district schedule or pre-zoning approach, and this would be a faster, easier way to achieve rental than through site-by-site rezonings. Finally, we asked Coriolis to test vacancy control, which council directed us to do through various motions. As you know, the province recently amended their annual rent increase formula in 2018 from inflation plus 2% to inflation only. What Coriolis tested was what would happen if at unit turnover, the rents could not be reset and could only be increased by inflation. Their testing showed that under our current incentives, vacancy control would make projects unviable with negative profit margins, so no one would proceed with it. In addition, the findings show that some of their costs, such as property taxes, insurance, and hydro, increases higher than the inflation rate over the long term. This would mean incomes would decline over time, and owners may not be able to keep up with costs of maintaining the buildings. Okay, that's the summary of Coriolis' finding. So what are the key takeaways from both consultancies? Rental incentives are creating rental, 8,700 approved units over the last 10 years. Both consultants concluded that incentives are needed to make projects work and that the current incentives are not enough. Coriolis found that rental is only marginally viable even with current incentives. While the programs are creating rental, improvements are needed. Most notably, policies need to be simplified and clarified to remove ambiguities, and processes need to be shortened. Third, affordability is important to residents, but this is challenging to achieve without additional incentives. Coriolis also found that vacancy control would not be viable under current parameters. Finally, the consultants note that most of the rentals approved under these programs have been along arterials or in areas that already allow multifamily developments, and note that there are opportunities to increase rental in lower density areas such as RS or RT that would provide more choice for renters. Because these areas do not need to compete with strata developments, the financial testing indicates that rental may work with less incentives or with more affordability than what is currently required in commercial and multifamily areas. So here are some images of the rental buildings open under these programs over the last 10 years. And that concludes the review part of the presentation. The full report from City Spaces and preliminary findings from Coriolis are now available on the city's website. Okay, so what does this mean for Vancouver moving forward? What's changed today since we put the rental programs in place 10 years ago? We completed the big citywide Housing Vancouver strategy in 2017 and found that there's no magic bullet or one perfect policy to solve the housing crisis. We need multiple actions and strategies to provide a range of housing to address the diverse spectrum of incomes and needs across the city. New purpose-built rental housing is a key housing type that meets a specific need. We can see this when we look at the distribution of renter incomes. We talk a lot about median incomes, which is a very important reference point, but it doesn't show the significant diversity of renter incomes in Vancouver. You can see that 30% of single households and over half of couple households earn incomes that can afford new market rents. There's also a significant portion of households that can't afford these rents, so we also need to be creating new social housing and below market housing, as well as to continue to protect the existing stock. We know that the affordability crisis has worsened over the last 10 years. There was a significant rise in home prices, represented by the red and yellow lines, in 2014, and that means that renters who could have afforded to own 5 years ago can no longer do so. And compared to ownership, new market rental is a more affordable option. To own a benchmark condo in the Eastside, an income of $130,000 is required, compared to $77,000 need to rent a new one-bed apartment. You can see these trends reflected in the formation of new renter households. In the last census period between 2011 and 2016, 76% of net new households were renters, compared to the previous census period between 2006 to 2011 at 41%. In addition to the affordability crisis, there are other macro trends that are affecting the demand for rental. A primary one is our growing economy. In 2018, the BC Economic Forecast Council projected that British Columbia's strong economy will outperform the overall rate in Canada over the next 3 years. And we know that the city of Vancouver is the largest job and population center in the region. There is a significant amount of employment space in the city that's currently under construction or approved for development. 5.6 million square feet of office, retail, and industrial space, which equates to space for almost 26,000 jobs. So we need to consider the accompanying housing need. And this is just what's already underway. These aren't growth projections. There is a staff team doing the employment lands and economy review, and they will be providing an update on more detailed employment projections later this fall. So given the large amount of the office space already approved, let's take a look to see what these new office jobs might look like. So here are some sectors and incomes that are generally associated with office jobs in Vancouver. So for sectors, professional and scientific services, information and cultural industries, and finance and insurance. Some of the specific occupations in these categories could be engineers, computer service professionals, those in HR, and general office workers. And they generally have individual incomes ranging from $47,000 to $90,000. So for many potential industries and occupations associated with office space, market rental will be a good housing option for both single and couple rental households. Couple households with 2 combined incomes can afford units with more bedrooms if they choose. Another topic that we heard a lot about recently is the issue of equity. Renters make up the majority of all households in Vancouver, but they are not equally distributed across the city. That's partly because the vast majority, 90% of all new approved purpose-built rental, have been located on arterials. There's also been some new rental built in multifamily areas in the downtown and recently approved community plan areas, but very little built in single-family or lower density areas. Through the post-occupancy survey, we heard from renters that they value the opportunity to live near transit and close to work, but noise and air quality is challenging when they are living on an arterial road. Here's a quote. As a young family, the proximity to the community center is a major factor why we stay here, but we are getting tired of the noise and pollution. There's limited choice for renters right now, and a greater variety of secure rental options in neighborhoods away from busy streets are needed. We know that lower density neighborhoods do provide rental, largely in the form of secondary suites and laneways, and that these are important housing options. However, they are not secure. Owners can choose to sell, redevelop, or move their family in at any time. We've also heard recently through our consultation process for the amended tenant relocation and protection policy that displacement was a key concern for renters living in the secondary stock. We also know that renting is increasingly the new normal for younger residents. 71% of households led by people under 45 are renters. This is up from 66% in 2006. These could be residents just starting out or families with young children trying to stay in the city, households that are critical for the economic health and diversity of the city. So let's move on now to look at the impact of growing demand on the existing rental stock. First, Vancouver has had a long history, over 30 years, of protecting the existing stock through the rental housing stock ODP. So this, combined with our incentive programs, has meant that we have actually been able to grow our rental stock. Our housing system is regional in nature, and the minimal supply of rental in some of the other municipalities, combined with rising demand overall, is placing pressure on our existing stock. And while we have been creating new rental supply, it's important to note that we are not meeting our targets for purpose-built rental. Housing Vancouver set 10-year targets for new housing types across the housing continuum and incomes. The dotted line in the chart represents where we should be in our targets, and you can see here that after 2 years, we are significantly behind on approving new market rental housing. With the rising share of higher income renter households, there's a risk they could be outcompeting lower income renters for our existing affordable rental stock. And this is made worse by the limited supply of market rental housing that is affordable to their incomes. We did an analysis comparing incomes to rents in the purpose-built rental stock and found that over 32,000 rental households have incomes between $80,000 to $150,000, compared to only 6,600 units priced at rents that are at 30% of their income. Without more supply, they would be looking for options at lower price ranges, which is generally in the existing rental stock. This is one factor that's putting upward pressure on rents. Since 2015, there has been an increasing gap between rents in the existing units to those that are vacant on the market. Looking at this chart, you can see that 5 years ago, rents were lower in vacant units compared to occupied units. Today, rents are higher in vacant units, and this creates a financial incentive for landlords to turn their units over. We've heard concerns that new market rental is driving rent increases in the existing stock. The NYU Furman Center did a comprehensive review of the literature on this issue, and key findings of this report are: 1, that new market rental is associated with moderation of rent increases citywide. 2, in some cities, rent increases were observed in neighborhoods where new rental was added. However, the report said multiple forces are potentially at work here, such as the desirability of the location and neighborhood amenities, so being close to transit, local shops, services, etc. Finally, the report suggests that a range of different housing strategies are needed to solve the affordability crisis, such as social housing, and that creating market rental is one necessary part of the answer. So that concludes the section on key trends impacting renters and rental housing today. So how will we incorporate all these findings into the next phase of work? So just a reminder, the key issues identified from the consultants are: there's a lot of challenges in creating new rental. It's not as financially attractive as Strata, so incentives are needed to close the gap. Second, the review identified a number of program improvements that can be made, including increasing clarity around form of development and simplifying our requirements and processes. Providing deeper levels of affordability is important, but requires additional incentives. And finally, we should explore allowing more market rental in lower density areas, but in ways that consider context and fit with existing neighborhoods. So in phase 2, our approach will be to address these issues and make program enhancements, but stay within the geographic boundaries of current policies. So we're not looking to expand the incentive programs to new areas of the city in phase 2. Regarding the work to allow more market rental in lower density neighborhoods, we'll be looking at ways to improve townhouse and apartment forms that are currently allowed through the Affordable Housing Choices policy, but any additional opportunities to increase rental in additional RS and RT areas will be explored with communities through the citywide plan process. So how will we do all this? So phase 2 involves 5 buckets of work. The objective of the first 3 buckets, amended rezoning policy, exploring rental tenure zoning in commercial areas, and changes to the DCL bylaws, are intended to make improvements to the existing rental incentive policies. The last 2 buckets, looking at early lessons from the moderate income rental housing pilot program and establishing a rental reinvestment pilot, are about achieving greater affordability in new rental and preserving the affordability and long-term resilience of the existing stock. We will explore improvements and ways to streamline the rezoning policy. For example, looking at combining Rental 100 and the affordable housing choices policies into one. We will also want to test new ideas, such as addressing issues identified through the recent climate emergency staff report, and explore ways we can enable near zero emission energy buildings in rental. And we'll also see if we can incorporate any early lessons from MERP to increase opportunities to create more below market rental. And we'll also look at ways to improve clarity around form and development, particularly in areas that are off arterials. In C2, where we have been getting the bulk of our rental developments, these have become fairly standard now. So we will be looking at providing additional clarity through a pre-zoned district schedule approach to simplify the process and reduce processing times by eliminating the need to do site-by-site rezonings. We'll also explore the use of rental tenure zoning in combination with a pre-zoned C2 district schedule. Council has also expressed interest through numerous motions, their concern around the loss of rental housing in C2 districts. So we'll also look for ways to protect the existing rental stock through the rental tenure zoning tool. The third bucket of work are changes to the citywide and utilities DCL bylaws. The overall objective is to improve administration and transparency of our definitions. We also want to explore the impact of narrowing the eligibility of the waiver, but what other incentives would be required to make market rental viable if we were to remove this incentive. We've had a motion from Councillor Fry on enabling new forms of hospitality to support rental, and this is something we will test in the upcoming phase. A key part of this work is to address concerns we've heard from the public and some councillors around the eligibility criteria, particularly as it relates to affordability. It's important to note that the province defines eligible developments for which DCLs can be waived, including the term for-profit affordable rental housing. We know that this term has caused confusion and sparked a lot of debate, and staff have been in discussions with the province to allow municipalities to waive DCLs for tenure in order to improve transparency. The next area of work is looking at achieving deeper levels of affordability and creating below-market rental through the MERP program. We know that in order to do this, significant extra density beyond what is allowed under the current market rental program is required. In order to make 20% of the units permanently affordable to incomes between $30,000 to $80,000 in a typical C2 site, significant extra density up to 14 stories required compared to 6 stories in the same location under Rental 100. In phase 2, we want to pull together early learnings to date and consider ways to extend the program, but anticipate former development issues to be a big part of the public discourse as these pilot projects move forward through the rezoning process. Finally, we wanted to bring forward some of the themes that were identified through our recent work on tenant relocation and the protection policy. There was significant interest from Council to protect our existing stock, but also to encourage reinvestment without displacement. So the last area of work is to look at piloting a rental and reinvestment program that encourages upgrades in aging rental buildings while keeping tenants in place, and to test implementation of new energy retrofit technologies like heat pumps. Our objective here is to provide landlords who want to reinvest in their buildings with resources and support, and we want to test ideas that can be made into policies down the line, including potential to leverage new rental development. In addition to the work that we will be doing in phase 2, there are also a number of other initiatives that are underway through PDS to increase more options for renters. The citywide plan just launched, and a number of community planning programs such as Broadway and Jericho are underway. In addition, the city is continuing to prioritize its efforts to deliver non-market housing through the short review, the development of the Vancouver Affordable Housing Endowment Fund, and through our capital plan implementation, which has allocated $540 million for the delivery of non-market housing. So in conclusion, new market rental fills an important need along the housing continuum. Incentives are needed to enable new rental, and that there are a number of improvements that we can make to our current programs during the next phase of work. Here's a reminder of the upcoming Phase 2 work program. We'll be bringing back policy recommendations through a report to Council late fall of this year, with implementation of the rental zoning and district schedules anticipated in Q1 of 2020. Thank you. That concludes this presentation, and we have a staff team here to answer any questions you may have.